welcome to another deep dive. We often get questions about coding, like how to actually do it when you're looking at all this qualitative data. So today, we really want to go beyond just the basic definition of coding. We'll talk about its nuances and how to actually apply it effectively. And, it's pretty interesting to see how we've gone from highlighters and printed transcripts to all these fancy digital tools. But the core process of analyzing that qualitative data, that really hasn't changed.
Yeah, exactly. We've got NVivo and all these other programs now that really help us do this in a systematic way. But the thinking part, the interpretation, that's all still very human.
Definitely. And as we go through this, you'll hear us using words like issues, themes, topics, concepts, sometimes even categories. Basically, they all mean the same thing as codes, which is the term our source material uses.
Right. Lots of different words for essentially the same idea.
Exactly. So let's get down to it. What is a code, really, when we talk about qualitative data?
So the resource you sent actually gives a really comprehensive definition from Saldana. It defines a code as a word or short phrase that symbolically assigns a summative, salient, essence-capturing, and or evocative attribute for a portion of language-based or visual data. And it goes on to emphasize that a code isn't just some neutral tag. It actually reflects your interpretation as the researcher. It's like a way of translating what's in the data. If you're reading an interview transcript and someone repeatedly mentions feeling unheard, a simple code for that could be feeling unheard.
All right, so it's like capturing the essence of that part of the data. And I think Bernard and his colleagues put it a bit more simply. They say coding is just about identifying themes in the text.
Exactly. And the beauty of codes is they can really cover a whole spectrum. The source material uses some interesting examples from Richards to illustrate this. So you could have a simple descriptive code, something like event on the playground.
Okay, pretty straightforward.
Right. But then you can go a bit deeper, have a more conceptual code for that same event, like maybe violence between children.
Okay, so moving from simply what happened to more the meaning behind it.
Yeah. And you can even go further, have an interpretive code, like cultural stereotyping. And all of this, it can be applied to that same bit of data about the playground event.
Wow, that's a great example. I mean, you can really see how the level of analysis can change with the code you choose.
Right. And that's really the power of it.
So ultimately, what's the purpose of all this coding? Why do we go through this sometimes labor-intensive process?
Well, I think the most basic goal is to index your data. It's all about creating a system where you can easily retrieve information later on. Whether it's about a single concept, like let's say cultural stereotyping, or even finding instances where multiple concepts come together. Maybe you want to see where cultural stereotyping, employee guidelines, and retention all overlap.
Right, so you're basically creating a map of your data so
Yeah.
you can easily navigate through all these different concepts.
Exactly. And naming these concepts through your codes is really important because it forces you to be more precise in your thinking and helps you organize everything. And Tesh has this idea of recontextualization, which coding enables. Basically, once you've coded something, you can see it in relation to other coded data rather than just within its original context.
Oh, that's interesting. So it helps you see those connections that might not be immediately obvious.
Exactly. And that's really what qualitative research is all about. It's not just describing, but it's about connecting and theorizing. So coding helps us move from looking at individual interviews or field notes to developing broader theories. But the beauty is you can always go back to those original sources and see how those codes are actually grounded in the data.
Right, it keeps you honest in a way.
It does. Patton describes those initial field notes and transcripts as this undigested complexity of reality. I think that's so accurate. Coding is what helps us make sense of all that chaos. It brings some order.
That's such a great way to put it. But our source also emphasizes that coding isn't just this mechanical process, right?
Oh, definitely not. It's not just about going through the motions. It's really an active, ongoing part of the analysis itself. It requires constant assessment and rethinking. If you just rush through coding without really thinking about what those codes mean, you're going to miss out on so much. You really need to be constantly reflecting on what those codes are telling you and how they relate to each other.
Absolutely. And speaking of different approaches to coding, I found the concept of splitters and lumpers fascinating. What exactly are those?
Right, so Bernard and Ryan came up with these terms. A splitter is someone who tends to create lots of very detailed, fine-grained themes. They're all about those subtle distinctions.
So they're really splitting the data into very specific categories.
Exactly. Whereas a lumper takes a more holistic approach. grouping things together under broader, more overarching themes. And the truth is, most researchers probably do a bit of both. But thinking about whether you tend to be more of a splitter or a lumper can be helpful.
Right. So if you're looking for a very nuanced understanding of a phenomenon, maybe that splitter approach makes more sense initially.
Exactly. But if you're more interested in broader patterns and connections, maybe starting with those bigger categories as a lumper makes more sense.
And the choice can also be influenced by your research methodology, right?
Absolutely. Some approaches, like Coffey and Atkinson suggest, might start with general themes and then get more detailed later, while others, like grounded theory or phenomenology, they often begin with that very detailed analysis and then build up to broader concepts.
Okay, so there's no one right way to do it. It depends on your research questions and your overall approach. Now, something that's always important in qualitative research is thinking about the researcher's role, and specifically how that plays into coding.
That's a really critical point. Our source emphasizes this as well. The codes we create, they're not completely objective. They are inevitably shaped by our own worldviews, our experiences, and biases. So you have to be aware of that.
Right, so it's almost like our codes are a window through which we're looking at the data.
That's a good way to put it. Our social identities, things like gender, race, class, our backgrounds, all of that shapes how we understand and engage with the world. So it's going to shape how we code too. And Morrow and Kettle's work is really relevant here, especially in the context of the COVID pandemic. They really highlight the importance of reflexivity, which is all about constantly thinking about our own role as researchers.
Right, it's about acknowledging those biases and how they might be influencing our interpretations.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that codes don't just magically appear. We actually create them.
Yeah.
And the constant comparative method that Glaser and Strauss talk about is a really key part of that.
Oh, right, the idea of constantly comparing different pieces of data to see what patterns emerge.
Exactly. And how much the researcher's role is emphasized can vary between different research methodologies. In something like autoethnography, the researcher's personal experience is absolutely central, while in other approaches, there might be more of a focus on the participants' perspectives. But ultimately, a complete separation between the researcher and the codes, that's not really possible.
Because it's this ongoing iterative process, right?
It's like we're shaping the codes, and then the codes are shaping our understanding. And as you were saying earlier, it's important to document those thoughts and reflections.
Yeah, that reflexive process is really important. And our source also points out that it's not just our personal identities that influence coding, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's also about our chosen research methods, the community of researchers we're part of, even our discipline and the specific participants we're working with. It's really a whole ecosystem of influences.
Right, so it's good to be aware of all those different factors.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk practicalities. Let's say you have all these interview transcripts, field notes, what have you. Where do you even begin with coding? What are some good strategies?
Yeah, so if you've got a manageable number of files, you might just dive right in. But if you've got a lot, our source suggests starting with a file that feels pretty typical or representative of your participants, or maybe a specific subgroup you're interested in.
Okay, so like a good starting point, something that feels kind of average.
Yeah, exactly. And then choose another file that really stood out, maybe one that was particularly detailed or had something unique about it. And then, maybe go for a third one that offers a contrasting viewpoint. That way, you get exposure to a broader range of ideas and how they're expressed.
That makes sense. You get a good variety early on. And the source even gives a great example of looking at contrasting viewpoints within a community, like the one about Barbara, who had strong opinions about development, and Helen, the real estate agent, who had a very different take on things.
Right. Starting to code those contrasting perspectives early on can lead to a more nuanced understanding of the topic. And there's that other example 7.1, about patient care experiences. It shows how even something like cleanliness or a doctor's manner can be seen as both positive and negative.
Oh, yeah. So coding not just for the issue itself, but also for whether the experience was positive or negative can really bring out some interesting contrasts.
Exactly. And that can lead to some really valuable insights.
It's amazing how much complexity can be hidden within seemingly simple things. Now, I think the biggest challenge for a lot of people is that moment when they actually have to start identifying codes in their own data. It's one thing to read about it, it's another to actually do it.
You're absolutely right. It can be pretty daunting. And one reason is that narratives are inherently complex. There's just so much going on at once in the story. The timing, the different people, their beliefs, the consequences, and it can be really hard to know where to start.
It can feel overwhelming for sure.
It can. The source gives some good advice here. Don't try to create one huge code that tries to capture everything. Instead, code each passage with multiple codes that are relevant. Like, instead of having a code for trusted friends or sought for advice, you could break it down into separate codes for trust, friends, and advice.
Right, so focus on those core elements.
Exactly. And then later on, you can look at the patterns and see how often those codes appear together. Maybe advice always appears alongside trust and friends, but never with family. Or maybe there are times when it's just advice and expertise without any mention of personal relationships.
Right, so you're building up a more complex picture by looking at those combinations. Okay, so what are some good strategies for actually finding those codes in the text?
Well, one very basic but essential strategy is to look for repetition. People often mention things multiple times if it's important to them, even if they use slightly different words. So noticing those repetitions is a good starting point.
Okay, so it's about picking up on those recurring themes.
Exactly. Another helpful approach is to ask questions of the text. The basic who, what, when, where, why, how, those are always good starting points. But also, thinking about those what-if questions can be really insightful. Like, what if the situation had been different? What if different people had been involved? How might that have changed things? Asking those kinds of questions not only helps you be more thorough, but it also makes you think about those causal relationships.
Right, so it's about actively engaging with the text and pushing yourself to think more deeply.
Exactly. And comparing and contrasting different parts of the text can be really revealing. Not just looking for similarities, but also asking, what's different here? Why might that be? And then, sometimes it's even helpful to think about hypothetical examples or extreme cases, like how would this situation play out if we change this one variable? That can help you really clarify the boundaries of your concepts.
Okay, so it's about actively manipulating the data in a way to see what insights you get.
Right. And our source also talks about the importance of paying attention to discourse, which is basically how language is used to construct meaning. The way people talk about things can be really revealing. So you might code for things like power dynamics in language, maybe how people use formal versus informal titles, or how they use persuasive language. Are they trying to convince someone of something? And how are they doing that?
Right, so it's not just about what they're saying, but how they're saying it.
Exactly. And finally, paying attention to the structure of the narrative itself can be really insightful. Thinking about things like transitions in the story, key turning points, maybe even inconsistencies or things that are left unsaid, those can all be meaningful and worth coding. Like if someone starts referring to the staff as my staff, that could signal a shift in their sense of ownership or responsibility.
Right, so it's about those subtle but important cues. So all these coding strategies are great, but where do those codes actually come from?
Well, our source outlines two main approaches. You've got what are called a priori codes and NVivo codes. A priori codes are those that come from your previous knowledge, maybe from the research literature you've read, or even your own research questions. Those initial ideas you had about the topic.
Right, so you're bringing some existing theoretical framework to the data.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that these a priori codes, they're not set in stone. They're more like starting points. Researchers sometimes call them sensitizing concepts that guide your initial exploration, but you have to be open to new ideas that might emerge from the data itself.
Right, so it's a balance between having some structure and also allowing for flexibility.
Exactly. Then you've got in vivo codes, also called indigenous codes. These come directly from the language used by your participants. You might literally take a phrase someone uses and turn that into a code.
So it's about staying true to the participants' own words.
Yes. But in vivo codes can sometimes be very specific to a particular participant or context. So as your project evolves, you might need to adapt them into more general concepts.
So you start with those very grounded codes, but then maybe try to see how they connect to broader ideas.
Exactly. And it's important to keep track of where those in vivo codes originally came from, so you can always go back and see how your thinking has evolved.
Now, another question people often have is about how detailed their coding should be. And the source material talks about broad brush versus detailed coding. So what's the difference?
Right, so thinking back to lumpers and splitters, broad brush coding is more of a lumper strategy. It's about dividing your text into those broader topic areas. It can be a great way to get an initial overview, especially if you're dealing with a lot of data. Some researchers even intentionally start this way. They get that big picture and then go back through and code in more detail later.
Okay, so start broad, then refine. And Janine's study on illegal file sharing is a good example, where she initially used those broad themes like cost, convenience, and choice.
Exactly. And she then used those themes as a basis to connect her findings to existing research. Detailed coding, on the other hand, is more of a splitter approach. It's that very close line-by-line analysis where you're really trying to unpack the text and identify all those subtle nuances.
So it's really about getting into the nitty-gritty details.
Yes. And you're not just identifying concepts, but you're also considering alternative ways to describe them, really thinking about the nuances of language.
So it's a much more intensive process.
It is, especially in those initial stages. And methodologies like grounded theory, they often emphasize this detailed coding. But you don't necessarily have to maintain that level of detail throughout the entire project. Once you've developed a good understanding of the key concepts, you can be more selective in how you code.
So it's about finding that balance between depth and efficiency.
Exactly. The key is to capture enough detail so that your codes are meaningful and retrievable.
Now, I know a lot of our listeners are interested in using NVivo for their qualitative analysis. So let's talk about how coding works in that environment.
Right. So in a lot of ways, coding in NVivo is similar to those more manual methods we've been talking about, like using highlighters or sticky notes. It's just a digital, more powerful version of that. But here's the important thing. When you code something in NVivo, you're not actually changing the original files.
Oh, that's good to know. So my data's safe.
Exactly. What NVivo does is create these pointers or references that tell the software where that coded segment is located in your original file. So it's like creating a bookmark in a document. The bookmark points to a specific passage, but the passage itself stays in place.
Right, so the data stays intact, which is reassuring.
It is, and that's one of the big advantages of this approach. It means your original files are never altered, the context is preserved, and if you make changes to your original files, those changes are reflected in your coding.
Wow, that's really efficient.
It is. And importantly, it allows you to code the same piece of text in multiple ways, so you can really explore the connections between different concepts.
And the source material recommends starting simple with your coding in NVivo, right?
Yeah, don't overthink it in those early stages.
Mhm.
Focus on creating those basic, non-hierarchical codes just to tag the ideas you're seeing. You can always organize them into categories or hierarchies later, once you have a better understanding of your data.
Okay, so start simple and then refine as you go along. Makes sense. And how do you actually go about creating and managing those codes within NVivo?
Well, NVivo has a few different areas for organizing your coding, but most of the action happens in the codes section. And the software is designed to be flexible, so you can really tailor it to your specific research needs. But it's important to remember that the software is just a tool. The thinking behind those codes, that still comes from you.
Right. NVivo doesn't do the analysis for you.
No, it doesn't. So there are a couple of ways to create new codes. You can do it beforehand, using the menu or right-clicking in the codes list and selecting new code, or you can do it on the fly as you're reading through your data. Just select a passage and choose to code it to a new code.
Okay, so you can either pre-plan some of your codes or let them emerge organically from the data.
Exactly. And as you're creating codes, remember that they should ultimately be driven by your research questions. What are you trying to find out? Your coding system will evolve as you learn more, so don't be afraid to add, merge, or even delete codes as needed. And make sure you're writing clear and concise descriptions for each code to remind yourself, and anyone else who might be looking at your project, what each code means.
Right, those descriptions basically become your code book.
Exactly. And Vivo makes it easy to export that codebook for reference or sharing. And while you're coding, make sure you're using the visual tools that NVivo offers, like coding stripes.
Yeah, those sound really helpful for getting an overview of your coding.
They are. You can quickly see which codes have been applied to a file and where the most coding has happened. And you can also customize the list view to show you additional information about each code.
Yeah, so it's about taking advantage of those visual cues to really get a sense of your data. Now, the source also talks about the emotional side of coding, those common feelings that researchers experience during this process.
Yeah, coding isn't just this cold mechanical process. There are definitely ups and downs.
Yeah.
You might feel excited when you start to see those connections, but you might also get frustrated when things seem messy or unclear. And that's okay.
Right, it's a process.
It is. And it's important to be aware of those feelings and to reflect on them. Maybe even write about them in your memos. Why are you feeling stuck? What assumptions might you be making?
Right, so it's almost like you're coding your own experience alongside coding the data.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to change your mind about how you're coding things. As you learn more, your understanding will evolve. And it's also important to pay attention to when multiple codes are appearing together, those constellations of codes that can really help you develop those deeper insights.
Now, I think one of the most common questions we get is, how long does this coding process actually take?
I know, right? Everyone wants a timeline. And it's tough to give a definitive answer. It really depends on the scope of your research, the complexity of your data, all those factors.
It makes sense.
Yeah, but experienced researchers like Miles and Huberman, they suggest that analysis, which includes coding, can take anywhere from 2 to 5 times as long as data collection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And another piece of advice from Lynn Richards that I really like is to take breaks every couple of hours and just write some memos. Capture those reflections and insights. It helps you stay fresh.
Makes sense. And how do you know when you've done enough coding? When do you stop?
Well, that's a good question. One clue is when you stop finding new themes or ideas. Unless you absolutely need to code everything for some reason, if you're not getting any new insights from coding, it might be time to move on to the next stage of analysis.
Okay, so it's about recognizing that point of saturation.
Exactly. And you might want to review a bit more data just to make sure, to see if there are any contradictions or new perspectives you might have missed. But if you're not seeing anything new, it's probably a good sign to move on.
And what about the number of codes? How many should you end up with?
There's really no magic number here. The goal is to have enough codes to help you generate, organize, and think about the ideas in your data, but not so many that it becomes overwhelming.
So it's about finding that sweet spot.
Right. It's about having a system that works for you and your research. If you find yourself creating a new code for almost every sentence, that might be a sign you need to step back and rethink. And it's helpful to remember a saying from an NVivo workshop that the source mentions. You can't overcode, but you can overnode.
What does that actually mean?
Well, in NVivo's older language, nodes were the same as codes. So it basically means it's better to code liberally, apply codes to anything that might be irrelevant, because you can always ignore those codes later if you don't need them. But having too many codes can just make your project more difficult to manage.
So it's better to err on the side of coding too much than too little?
Yes, within reason, of course. And don't forget to write those code descriptions to help you keep track of what each code means. It's especially important if you're working with a team or if you come back to your project after a break.
And what about how much text to select when you're coding? Any tips there?
Yeah, the key here is to include enough context so that the coded passage makes sense later on, but not so much that it becomes unwieldy. If you're coding really short segments, it can be hard to interpret them later. So it's often better to err on the side of including a bit more context.
So it's a balancing act. And a question that often comes up with interview data is, do you code the interviewer's questions as well?
Yes, generally it's recommended to include the interviewer's text, especially when it directly relates to the participant's response. It just helps you understand the flow of the conversation and what prompted the participant to say what they did.
Right, it preserves that context.
Exactly. But if the question is just a simple yes or no, or something that doesn't really add to the meaning of the response, then you might not need to code it.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've talked a lot about creating codes, but what about sharing that information? How can you print or export that list of codes from NVivo?
Right. So you can print your code list directly from the main list view. You can also export it to different file formats. And there's the specific export codebook function that creates a more comprehensive document, including your code descriptions. Just make sure that you've customized your list view to show the information you want before you export.
So lots of options for getting that coding framework out of NVivo and into a format that you can share. And beyond just looking at lists, what are some other ways to explore your coding within NVivo?
Right. Visualizations are a great way to see patterns in your coding. NVivo has these code charts that show you which files are linked to a particular code and comparison diagrams that let you see the similarities and differences between different project items. And then you have coding queries, which are super helpful for finding those intersections between two or more codes.
So it's about going beyond just listing the codes to really understanding how they connect.
Exactly. And you can even use highlighting within a document as a quick way to see where different codes overlap before you run a more formal query.
Okay, so it's about using those visual tools to really dig deeper into your data. So as our listeners start to work with their data, what are some of the next steps they might want to consider after this initial coding stage?
Well, as you get more familiar with your codes and your data, you'll naturally start asking more complex questions. You might wonder if a particular code is too broad or too narrow, or you might realize that your understanding of a concept has shifted. You'll also likely want to start organizing your codes into a hierarchy or some other structure that makes more sense for your project.
So it's about refining and developing that coding framework.
Exactly. And then you can start using those visualizations and queries to really explore your data in more depth. What this deep dive has really covered is that foundational level of coding, getting started with that process. And there are definitely more advanced techniques and strategies to explore as you move beyond this basic level, especially when you're working with a powerful software like NVivo.
So we've really covered a lot of ground today, and I think the main takeaway is that coding is so much more than just putting labels on your data. It's really a dynamic, iterative, and thoughtful process that's at the heart of qualitative analysis. And with tools like NVivo, you have that flexibility to go back and revise your decisions as your understanding evolves. Ultimately, the goal is to go beyond just describing what you're seeing and start generating those meaningful interpretations.
Absolutely. And as the source emphasizes, don't forget to write. Capture those memos and document your coding journey. It'll make your analysis so much richer.
Couldn't agree more. Now, as you continue your qualitative research adventures, here's a final thought to consider. How might consciously adopting a splitter versus a lumper approach in your initial coding actually shape the kind of insights you ultimately uncover from your data? Something to think about as you embark on your own fascinating research journeys.